Hi, and welcome to Unco, a podcast about what's unusual in tech. I'm your host, Timothy Buck. In this week's episode, I sat down with Mark and Paul Johnson. They're friends of mine and founders of an education platform company called Pathwright. We talked about how we see technology impacting education over the next 50 years, how the technology behind Google Duplex could replace the need for tools like Zapier, all the ramifications that we could think of self-driving cars, what we want to see from Apple at WWDC, and more. If you'd like to help me keep Unco around, become a patron over at patreon.com/uncofm. Hey Mark, hey Paul.
Hey Tim.
Hi Tim.
It's nice to be here.
Yeah, it's nice to have you on. So for most of my audience, this is Mark and Paul Johnson. I've known them for quite a while now, and I'm really excited to have them on the show. Can you guys just introduce yourselves and give a little bit about who you are, what you do, and what you're interested in?
Sounds good. Mark, why don't you go ahead and go first, and then I'll follow.
All right. So I'm Mark Johnson. I'm the CTO and co-founder of Pathwright. So we'll probably talk a little bit more about Pathwright later, but most of what I do is kind of the design side of code. So I do a lot of architecture, like system design to a certain degree, but a lot of like platform design type stuff these days. And I do end up writing a good amount of code when I'm not managing the other devs on our team.
And I am Paul Johnson, also Mark's twin brother. So if we sound alike, that's why. And I am the CEO of Pathwright and one of the co-founders. I started it with Mark back in 2012. And my main job is to sit in meetings and answer emails all day. But really what I do as, I guess, CEO right now, my focus is trying to simplify things, remove obstacles, provide clarity in pretty much everything that's happening at Pathwright.
So I do want to kind of get into some questions about education, but it might be helpful for my listeners to know a little bit more about what Pathwright actually does so that they have the context when we dive into the conversation about education and technology.
Sure, I'd be happy to take that. And Mark, just jump in if there's anything you want to add here. Mm-hmm. So Pathwright is a web-based software tool that anyone can use to teach anything. And I really do mean anyone can teach anything. And one of my favorite things about working at Pathwright is getting to learn about so many different topics from the many amazing teachers who teach in really cool ways. So like a few examples, we have this awesome local organization called Reach Out and Read, which has an incredible team of people that train family doctors all over the country and South Carolina to recognize literacy milestones in young children. And they coach their parents on how to develop those reading habits. So they use Pathwright to teach the doctors how to train parents on this really important topic. Like a little bit further away, we have a large customer who is basically the Uber of Asia. One of their divisions in Malaysia uses Pathwright, and they test and validate basically over 10,000 potential drivers every month. I think it's actually more like 12 to 13,000 now. So they're actually making sure their drivers are ready to drive people around Malaysia, and they use Pathwright to do that. One of our larger customers that some of your listeners may have come across is All Recipes. So allrecipes.com is the number one recipe site in the world, and they use Pathwright to offer these fun online cooking lessons. And I like that one because you can take the lesson and then you eat your homework. It's kind of unique to their school, I think.
Yeah.
But we have, hundreds of, big and small businesses, homeschool parents, churches, and all kinds of people, using Pathwright to teach everything in, virtually every context. So that's a bit of what Pathwright does and, who uses it. Tim, do you think is there anything, Mark, that you would add, or Tim, that would be helpful for your listeners to understand about Pathwright?
I guess one thing worth mentioning might be that we're kind of like a horizontal product, really. So we're not like really deep in any one vertical, which is kind of a mixed bag as far as from a business perspective. But we've always thought of Pathwright more as a platform for education for any type of teaching. So it's more like on the side of like a Trello for project management or something like that is very horizontal and doesn't really have like a particular industry niche.
Cool. Yeah, I think that is really helpful because that kind of sets the stage for one of the first questions I wanted to ask, which was how do you guys see technology impacting education over the next 50 years? And I think what you've said already kind of shows that the word education is super broad. I think when I wrote the question, I was thinking more of like educating children or high schoolers, college students. But like you've shown, education is a lot more than that.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really great place to start. So, like over the next 50 years, and I hope Pathwright can be a big part of this. Our dream is that education becomes more of something that everyone understands that they should learn how to do, and that are probably already doing. So, to me, this first stood out when I was in a Barnes & Noble. So this was years ago when those existed or were more around. And I was noticing that I was looking for education books because, obviously we're in education. I was trying to see what they had on the topic. And I noticed that, there's whole sections on things like leadership and finance and things that most people would be like, yeah, I could probably learn about that, or maybe I should learn about that. It's like a category that people understood, this is important. I could grow here. But education is not one of those. In fact, the education section at Barnes & Noble at the time, and probably now still, was just highly technical. It was either like a political book about everything wrong with education and policy, or it was like curriculum material, but extremely technical. And it just struck me that so many people are educating, but they don't think of it that way. And I like to say that like education has a branding problem because people don't recognize that they're even doing it. But if you're a team leader, there's a whole lot of education that you're doing for your employees and your teammates. If you're a parent, you are your children's primary teacher, and that's like undeniable. If you are a member of a church, likely you're teaching some people in some way. So I think that's one of my hopes about as far as how education could change in the next 50 years. And I think one way technology can impact that, and it's not all about technology, obviously, but is by providing a horizontal tool like Pathwright that anybody can use to teach anything, and it feels like I could use this to teach anything. It doesn't feel like this is just for a K through 12 classroom teacher or a university professor or a team trainer.
Yeah, I would, from my perspective, from like a tech side of things, like as far as where education's going to go, obviously we have more educational resources at our disposal than any time in history. The fact that we have like basically the equivalent of all of the world's knowledge in our pocket with our phones is a tremendous leap forward in education. So I think a lot of the style of education that we've seen built up in K through 12 and in universities, where it's a lot about knowledge transfer and like fact memorization, that kind of education is going to become either automated or just completely unnecessary because why do we need to know, the Battle of Hastings date or whatever in our everyday life when we can look it up literally in like 5 seconds? So like this approach of just memorizing facts about things, I think it's going to take a while to shift because it's so ingrained into kind of the factory style education that is prevalent in our schools. But eventually I think people are going to start breaking through to project-based learning, more creative thinking, things that aren't fact-based, things that can't be automated. In a sense, like I think the liberal arts are going to be revitalized to a point because it's one of the only areas of knowledge that can't be automated or offset by, just the internet and the mass exposure of information that we have.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I just finished a book called Grit. Mm-hmm. Forgetting who wrote it. Angela Duckworth wrote it. It's really good. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. But she mentioned something in there about IQ scores. And I don't fully understand how IQ scores are like set, but she said if the average IQ today was compared to the average IQ 150 years ago, that we today would be above average back then. And that them today, like their average person would be considered like needing to go to a special education classes today. Basically, partly has to do with the way that we're teaching now. And you guys were mentioning that we still do a lot of memorization, but one of the points she was making is that compared to back then, we do a whole lot more of teaching people to think creatively. And even though like you and I might say we don't do enough of it, she gave a bunch of examples of how what an average like 5-year-old today can can determine, I think the question she said was like, what's the same about what make a dog and a rabbit similar? And today kids just kind of get that. They can answer that question. Any little kid is going to have some sort of answer for that. But back then, the same questions were asked in the IQ test, and they didn't have answers for them. The average child had no clue. And I thought that was really interesting, that even though we're seeing, it feels like the transition in how we educate is really, really slow. It's already been happening over on that type of time scale of, like hundreds of years, because like you said, we don't need to memorize as many things as they had to memorize to be productive parts of society.
Right.
Yeah, and I think just to kind of put a fine point on one specific case that I'm pretty confident kids don't need to learn at all, that millions of kids learn every week right now, is another language. So I don't know if you've seen the technology that they have where you can have an earpiece now, and using artificial intelligence and just computers that will in real time translate one language to another, so that you are hearing the person you're talking to who may be speaking Chinese in your language and they're hearing you in their language. And so not to say that there aren't other benefits to learning a language, there certainly are. Like kids that learn other languages, like at the right time, that does something to their brain where they understand literature better, they can communicate better. So it's a functional improvement, but it's not a practical thing to learn, in my view, if we're looking out even, 10, 15 years from now.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. As technology does more to help us communicate with people around the world, we're not going to have to learn their other languages necessarily for that. But one thing, like you were mentioning, there are other benefits. I studied Mandarin in college for a couple of years, and I know for me, even though like today, if someone came up to me, I would not do a very good job of talking with them. I learned a lot about Chinese culture and Chinese, I guess, like the way that their language changes the way they see the world that I never would have understood if I hadn't studied that. So I think there's still some value there, but like you said, it may not be as much practical value if everybody can talk to anybody in any language with a piece of technology.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that highlights another thing that I hope will change in the next 50 years. And I think we're seeing some of this, but is that, the value you would get in the future for learning something like a language is a better understanding of people. So you can communicate across cultures in more meaningful ways, in more important ways, not just translate this word to that word, because that will be done. And I hope that technology can do that across the board, because at Pathwright, we view the features that we're making for teachers and learners as doing one of two things. Either it's eliminating pain, like the friction, the busy work, the paperwork, so that they can actually focus on what they're trying to do, which is either teach or learn, or it's giving them what we call like a superpower, like a steroid, something that enables them to teach way more people than they possibly could before, or teach people more deeply, or know something about the student when they're giving them feedback that's really important to how you give the student feedback, and surfacing that information so that teachers can then use it. And I think overall, that's technology's role. And I hope the progression that we see in the next 50 years is that we remove enough of the friction around teaching and the busy work, all that baggage around it, and we give enough superpowers and insights to teachers that they have at hand through these tools, that teaching actually becomes way more personal and way more human, and thus a lot more effective.
Yeah. Yeah, I think everyone can agree that would be really good if we can see that happen over the next 50 years. It's really interesting. Did you have anything else around education that you were interested in talking about? Do you have any topics there?
Oh, I mean, we could probably do that all day.
Yeah.
Mark, maybe something about personality. You want to talk about that a little bit? That's something we've been thinking about a lot recently, is like how does something like traits that you really can't change. So someone's core personality is kind of wired into their brain. It's not going to be taught a lot. Like, how does that impact teaching, like an effective teaching? So that might be interesting to talk about. Mark, do you have any thoughts you'd want to share there?
Yeah, I think that goes to like what we call personalized learning. So a lot of what people think of when they think of personalized learning is some sort of like Duolingo or Khan Academy style, like based on how you performed in this last set of quiz questions, we're going to show you this question next. And gradually, you might earn badges or something to reach a certain level of mastery, which that's one form of personalized learning. That's like automated personalized learning. But I think, again, this kind of goes back to where tech can really help for those kind of drill-based scenarios where you might be like drilling on mathematics or drilling on like a fact-based history cards or something like that. But there's a human element to personalization that you really can't automate super well, but you can provide insight for. And so I think that's where personality traits and skill measurement type assessment can really help a teacher who's acting as a coach or a guide or a mentor, which I really hope that in the future that's what education shifts to, is more of a mentorship type model. Then I think personalized education gets really interesting because you could use a lot of like personality tests, personality assessment, and skill assessment type things to inform a human being, an actual teacher, to make a better decision with a particular student. So you might see that, this student tends to respond better to concrete feedback based on their personality traits and their history. So we suggest that when you're grading their work that you give it in this format or something like that. That's just one little example of what you might do with that type of information. But I think the really interesting part about it to me is not so much like automating the learner experience to the point where you're not really interacting with a human. It's like, how can you actually take the elements of a person and what their journey is and what they're trying to learn and how they best learn, and then inform that teacher to be able to best give them the right next step. So we are exploring a few ideas with that already with some partners, but I think there's a whole lot of research and work to be done in that field, like of personalized learning, to where personalized learning doesn't mean I'm just sitting in front of my computer and not interacting with other human beings, but personalized learning means like true mentorship that happens in an informed way that wouldn't be possible without like a more accurate way of measuring where a person is at.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I think I see some parallels between what you guys are talking about with this, taking all the kind of the cruft away and allowing teachers and students to focus not necessarily on just memorizing or whatever, but focus on a teacher helping a student grow and empowering that teacher to do that. The same thing like we were talking about with language. Like if we're learning a language and it's not for purely, I need to memorize all the vocab so that I can communicate. It's instead, I'm learning this language so that I can better understand other people. And you go into that with, I guess, like kind of like that deeper, like one step deeper as your focus, as your goal. I think that changes things in a way that I can't necessarily like play out in my head, but it definitely changes things.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, I think one story kind of to back this up, like when Paul and I were younger, we were homeschooled for part of our education. And this was in the like late 90s during the dot-com boom, when no one really understood what the internet was. But we had gotten our hands on an HTML for Dummies book. And in particular, I found it like really intriguing. So I started like, typing in these HTML tags in Notepad and then, opening it up in Internet Explorer because that's what you did at the time. And, making little websites basically. And I didn't really know what I was doing. But at the time, my mom, like who was observing this and knew nothing about the internet, still probably doesn't know a ton about the internet. She's just not, super into techie stuff, but she's really into education and making sure that we're playing to our strengths. So she saw that like passion kind of that I was developing for code. And she recognized, this is something that's probably going to be a big deal in the future. So she incorporated that into our curriculum. And so that's a good example of personalized learning that only a human would have been able to do. The fact, like machines can only operate off of like the domain and data that they're in. So if you have a language training bot, it's only going to operate within the known scope of language training. And that's true of any, kind of machine, no matter how advanced it is. To have someone who can look into the future and see like this is a prime opportunity for this person where they're at right now, and even in an unknown domain to that person, that requires like a human level of intuition that I don't think we're even close to in machines and may never actually happen. So I think that's where providing opportunity and insight to real people in a personalized learning context is super important, because a computer really can't push you beyond the domain that it's already operating in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, that's really interesting. So I guess speaking of computers, did you see the Google Duplex? Did you see the news around Google Duplex or watch the video from Google I/O?
Yeah, that was pretty crazy stuff.
Yeah. What are you? What are your? Well, first of all, I guess I'll give like a brief description because I don't know if most of my listeners have probably heard about it. But Google Duplex is basically this thing that Google presented at Google I/O. It's not released yet. It's something they're working on, but it was pretty impressive. And basic idea was you could ask your Google Assistant to set an appointment with, say, a local restaurant that doesn't have any sort of internet presence or online booking. And you just kind of ask your Google Assistant to do that. And then in the background, the assistant would actually call that restaurant and have a conversation with the person working at that restaurant around getting you a reservation. This is all like without you being involved, and then set a reservation and give you a notification saying, "Hey, the reservation happened. It's at this time." And it was pretty impressive to see the recording or listen to the recording of the conversation that this Google Assistant had with the people working at the restaurant. And since then, I guess that was a while ago now, a week and a half ago or something. But there's been a lot of conversation around the ethics of that and where this is going, where this technology will eventually go. Do you have any thoughts on that, Mark?
Yeah, I've actually been drafting a Medium post about idea I had around this. I don't think it's like original to me, but I might give you a little bit of a preview of what I'm thinking. I think it's really interesting to have a computer that can talk English to another human being in a way that sounds like realistic enough where you might be like, is this a robot? But you're not totally sure. It's going to that like Turing test idea of where you can't distinguish between, a computer agent and a human agent in a kind of a blind chat scenario. So that to me is really fascinating that this demo, whether it's like completely real or not, I'm a little bit skeptical about these kind of demos just because we've seen this kind of stuff before where they'll show something that looks amazing, but in practice, it doesn't really work quite as well as it is demoed. But it's an interesting thought exercise, though, to kind of go through what might happen if something like Duplex was like mainstream. And I think one of the first things that will happen is that, you're going to get a lot of businesses that are inundated with robocalls that they can't really distinguish, is this a human or a robot, unless these robots have to identify themselves. So there's like the ethical side to that. Like, do these have to introduce themselves like a normal human would? And I would guess the answer to that will probably be yes. But even so, if you're talking to a robot and you're talking to a robot, like it seems kind of like a waste of time in some ways to be like booking with this robot instead of just talking to a human. So I think what will start happening inevitably in a world like that, now, I don't know how this will actually play out, but it's an interesting thought exercise that these businesses will start having agents that answer the phone too. So then you've got a scenario where you've got computers talking to computers in English, which sounds really crazy. And from a programmer's perspective, it kind of sounds a little bit terribly inefficient and horrible to have computers talking to each other in English. It's like, well, that's a waste of time. But if you think about it, it's got a lot of kind of interesting side effects and benefits to that. For example, if we've got a robot talking to another robot in English, if it realizes that it's talking to another robot, which it could, just by detecting, whatever, there would be a way it would know it's talking to another automated agent. It could have that same conversation in, a couple hundred milliseconds maybe, but still record the transcript in English. So there you have a transaction that happened. Maybe it booked a restaurant or scheduled something on your calendar, but you as the person who was booked can listen in on that conversation, in like human time and hear exactly what happened. So if something went wrong, you can identify that. If you just are curious and you want to know what your robot assistant is doing, you can listen in. And even if they're talking to other robots, that would be the first time in human history where you could have computer systems talking to each other, which typically happens in code, but you could have a non-technical person listening in on that and understanding what's happening, which is pretty crazy. And then I think assuming that these robots can understand each other well enough, it kind of replaces a lot of the needs for like a workflow APIs. So we've got all these API systems like Zapier or if this then that help us like connect different services. But if we have these trainable agents that can answer the phone for us for our business, so if I sell donuts or whatever, I can train my agent to understand my menu and like what my prices and hours are and all that stuff. Then in theory, you can connect any of these businesses to any other business without any code happening, because they're all speaking English. And so that's the other part of it that's really crazy to me, is that in some sense, it could replace the need for a lot of API type code if these agents can talk to each other in English. And it's really interesting, too, that these conversations that are happening between these machines can be listened into to see what's actually happening.
Oh, yeah.
So it's just got a lot of interesting ramifications on that side. And I'm not really sure if it's a realistic idea or not, but it is an interesting kind of thought exercise.
Yeah, that is super interesting. I know I don't know where I heard this, but somebody was saying that they may not be allowed to record because of the laws that we have. Our phone system laws were created so long ago, and there's a lot of states where both parties have to agree for a call to be recorded. And if that's true, then they can't record the call in a lot of states unless they upfront say, hey, I'm going to record this call. Is that okay? And then the person says yes. So in the case of it being like two robots or whatever, they could definitely just do that.
Yeah, they just agree with each other right away. Yep.
Right. But it does add a wrinkle into how this will work with actual people in a lot of places. And then another step away from that, again, I'm forgetting where I saw this. If I can find it, I'll add it in the show notes. But somebody was saying that they were reading the the dev notes about how all this works, and that basically it's an AI, obviously, but it's an AI that's being watched by humans. So if a call happens and it's not working, it can throw out the call to an actual human to finish that transaction. And that's how it's set up today. And that immediately made me think, whoa, I don't know how I feel about that.
Yeah.
I say, hey, and maybe if it's just like a restaurant, that's not a big deal. But they specifically gave the example of, in Google I/O in the presentation, of like having setting a doctor's appointment for your sick child. Like, I don't know how I'd feel about a person sitting somewhere who's like just gets thrown on the call and is now like scheduling, is like talking to my doctor about my child and scheduling an appointment and answering all these really personal questions. I don't, my initial reaction to that is not very positive. And I think like the concept is that's not going to happen very often. And that as this thing grows and becomes more and more successful, that it would basically not have to happen at all anymore. But as it's learning, as this AI is learning, that it seems to be a key component of it. So that like the AI would be like listening to that conversation that the human's having, and then learning like, oh, this is how I would handle this situation, and that's how it would learn to handle it the next time it has a similar call. Which makes a lot of sense, but I don't know how that applies to the privacy side of things. It's not just a computer knowing this information; it's like another human.
Yeah, it definitely gets tricky.
I think artificial intelligence in general is a bit of a privacy minefield, which is both concerning and also very frustrating to me, because particularly the first thing you mentioned there, that the thing that's going to keep this type of AI scenario from happening and being super useful fast is going to be, our laws, which were written with this not in mind at all. So, for example, the law to not be able to record a conversation, well, that's a great law for privacy's sake, but it's a really horrible law for, trying to have two bots talk to each other that you can read a transcript of. And if you can't record that transcript, then actually it adds a level of like uncertainty and insecurity in that scenario. So it's one of those frustrating realities of technology, and this is definitely true in education, but also like with self-driving cars, that the biggest barriers are often the laws that we have on the books in the bureaucratic political process that is necessary to adapt them and optimize them for the new reality. So yeah. Anyway, I could rant on that for a while, but that's one of the very frustrating things to me almost every time I get in my car, and I wish I didn't have to turn the wheel and push the pedals.
You mean to like start your car? I'm missing that. What you're talking about?
He just doesn't want. He doesn't want to drive.
Yeah. I don't want to drive.
Okay.
I hate driving, and I would just want the car to go where it knows I need to go automatically while I'm watching Netflix or getting some work done.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you there. Yeah, definitely. I drive like an hour and 20 minutes a day. So I would much rather not be.
Yeah. Okay. I should retract my angst about that a little bit then, because I only drive for 15 minutes a day, but I still get frustrated.
Yeah.
I just need to learn a little bit more patience.
Yeah, that is one thing about the Bay Area. Like a lot of people don't drive at all, just because like there's actually somewhat decent public transit, and a lot of people bike and walk and stuff. But and so I don't really drive at all on weekends. But for work, I'm not really in a place where I can take public transit, so I have to drive. And it can be frustrating as soon as there are self-driving cars. But I think we can get into self-driving cars if you want. I think the interesting thing about self-driving cars is that I don't up front we'll probably be buying them, but pretty quickly after they become common, I don't see myself buying a self-driving car. I could just see myself saying, "Hey, Lyft or Uber or whatever, pick me up and take me to this place." And if the like financial structures are right and they can charge low enough for that, because they're like not having to pay a human, instead they're just like taking the price of that car and dividing it by how many rides it can possibly do over its lifetime, then it could be really cheap to go to work every day in a car that I don't own. And that's what I really want. I don't want to have to like own a self-driving car and change the tires on it. I would much rather just like hit a button, it shows up, I go, and then it's gone, and I get in another one when I'm going home. That's ideal for me.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat there.
Yeah, totally agree with you there. I think that's an ideal scenario. Is just you walk out of your house at a certain time, and the car knows you're going somewhere, and it shows up, takes you there, and then it's there when you need to go back home.
Yeah,
I
completely agree.
can't remember where I saw this, but someone wrote I think it was another Medium post or something about just some of the ramifications of like self-driving cars for like shopping scenarios. So like if you could have like especially like if a car is self-driving, it doesn't really have to match any particular conventional shape because humans don't have to get inside of it. So you could have like a kind of container looking car that was just a dressing room with clothes in it that you could, say, I want to try on these, 5 outfits or whatever. The car drives to your house, you try them on in their little changing room, take the ones you want, and it leaves. So like I'm not saying that would happen specifically, but it does open the door for a lot of scenarios that aren't just transportation. It's like actually bringing like things for you to try, or groceries or whatever to you.
Yeah, it honestly, like I think that the reason this is like a fun topic to talk about is because it can go so many places.
Oh man, yeah.
Like if you just want to like dive deep on how it changes, like how it changes our economy and like the jobs out there that have to do with cars or are related to people driving and stopping somewhere to fill up cars with gas, or I don't know. It touches so many different areas, and I don't even think we've necessarily thought of all of the ramifications of like if we have cars, like you were saying, that are delivering things, and other cars that are dressing rooms, and other cars that are taking people to work, and others that are, I don't know, if you're going on a long trip, maybe like flying isn't as important because like you can get from San Francisco to LA just as fast because you just like get in a room shaped car that is like you just watch TV in, and you're like in your comfortable couch watching TV, and then you're there.
Yeah.
And then like how do all those things interact on our roads? Like there's so many places this conversation can go. It's really interesting.
Yeah,
I tend to think that. Oh, go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, when you combine that with like Hyperloop and those kind of ideas too, it gets even more interesting.
Yeah, I think one of the implications that is really cool, that makes me even more impatient for this future, is that once enough cars or all cars are self-driving, then we don't need stop signs or traffic lights. Like, we don't need any of that because the computers are going to optimize the traffic flow based on conditions just automatically. And everybody's going to get places faster too because they don't have to stop. And they can actually go at a speed that are safe for computers and not safe for humans. So that's the other thing is I think you're absolutely right that it's going to affect airline travel because suddenly these short airline flights make way more sense to just sit in a comfortable car and watch Netflix or work in like this nice portable office / living room than it does to go through security and hop on a plane. But I also think the speed of everything, especially if you like have hyperloops going with that cars can get in and shoot down like a crazy vacuum tube like way faster. Like if you combine that idea, like even going from where I am in Greenville, South Carolina to New York City, like I would definitely choose the car every time, compared to the hassle of flying. So I think we could keep talking about that, but there's a lot of really cool implications that just make me so much more impatient for the kind of political, bureaucratic obstacles to be overcome, and I just hope it happens sometime in my lifetime.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's definitely a lot of like questions around that because then if these cars are going, I don't know, 400 miles an hour, 200 miles an hour, or whatever, then they have to be in an area that people can't just like walk in front of, like we don't, there's like, I don't know. It would be ideal if it was like a Hyperloop type thing where it was in some sort of tube so that it doesn't have to worry about like people walking in front or like any issues like that. But I think that's probably a ways away because of the amount of like infrastructural change that'll have to happen for that to be common. Mm-hmm. But like the first step of having cars that can drive people that like rich people buy, I think is going to happen relatively soon. And then I think hopefully, fingers crossed, in our lifetime, we'll see that kind of like trickle down and begin to affect all the other different parts of our lives and economy. And there's probably a lot of really good startup ideas there.
Yeah. I told my 5-year-old once that when he got older, he probably wouldn't need to learn to drive because computers would drive for him. And he seemed to think that was a good idea. He's like, yeah, the police, he said something about like the police won't have anything to do then or something.
That's funny.
That is an interesting implication though, because how much of our police force's time and expense is like dedicated just to traffic, like an amazing amount. And if you eliminate most of the accidents and most of the law breaking because humans aren't in control of it from traffic, like that just has huge implications for just police force in general.
Yeah.
So I agree. This is a big sprawling topic. It impacts so many things. It's hard to even know where to start.
Yeah, and it affects like our hospitals because, they're all set up for the fact that we have a crazy number of accidents in every city every single day. And so they have a whole like infrastructure set up for that. And if this happens and it really does what everyone is saying it'll do, which is like take those number of accidents from way too many to a lot less than that, then that'll impact even the way that our hospital systems are set up and the way our hospitals are designed and the way that like, I don't know, it's crazy. So I guess moving on from self-driving cars, although we could probably talk about that for a lot longer. Oh, yeah. Is there, I know you guys are like you guys are Apple users. You use Apple devices and iPhones and Macs. Do you still use like iPhones? I know that's been pretty common for people to switch to Pixel or whatever. Are you still iPhone users?
Yeah, we both got the iPhone 10, so if that tells you anything.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, me too. So WWDC is just a couple weeks away here now. Is there anything in particular that you're interested in seeing from Apple, whether it be related to education or Siri or whatever, anything at all, hardware, software that you're interested in seeing announced at that event?
Yeah, I'm looking to get a new MacBook Pro. I've got like the early 2009 one, and it's still chugging along fine, but just with all the problems I've seen with people having with the keyboards and stuff on the newer MacBook Pros, I'm hoping they'll come out with something new in there that resolves some of those issues.
Yeah, and I think one thing that Mark always mentions and hopes is going to happen every time, and I do too, is like that they would add support for just like texting Siri. Like, it's kind of boggling how you have to talk to her, which is like really inconvenient if you're in an office space, for example. So like Siri is now on the Mac, but you have to be in a place where you can actually just talk to your computer out loud for that to be practical to use. But if you could just like type in a little chat message or iMessage Siri and get the same written response back that Siri vocally tells you, that would be really helpful. I'd probably use it a whole lot more.
Yeah, I know that is an accessibility feature, but the thing that sucks about it is it's like a one-way street. So if you turn it on, you can only text to Siri. You can't speak to Siri. So hopefully that was like a half step, because I think that came last year, and hopefully that was them. Like they built half of it, but they weren't quite ready to like have a big announcement that you can now have a text conversation with Siri. And hopefully over the last year they've improved it enough to have that come out, because I would definitely use that too. That's a good one.
As far as like other stuff that I would hope for is, it seems like it's been a while since Apple's had like a one more thing type surprise. And I know this isn't like a type of keynote or something where they're going to do something like that, but it would be really cool if they just had some stuff up their sleeves on the dev side that people haven't been anticipating. Like, Mark and I have talked a lot about how, in some sense, like Apple is probably like the best positioned company potentially to do something like bring augmented reality or VR like mainstream, since they have the ability to make in the reach to get devices that are simple and easy to use and cool for the average consumer, compared to like something like Google Glass, which was so nerdy and complicated that it didn't go anywhere. And they also just have the computing power in many of their devices. So like the iPhone 10, for example, or the HomePod, there's so much processing power in there that if you could use their way of streaming to another screen or just a pair of glasses and having it powered by your phone or your HomePod, like you could be rendering very complex real-time 3D images in front of whatever you're seeing, since the glass would just be kind of like a projector. So I have no idea of whether or not they're going to do that, but it seems like they're positioned to do it with the technology they have. So I always hope when they're doing these developer-related announcements that something like that may be coming.
Yeah, I definitely hope so. And I know Tim Cook he's made a lot of statements about it. Like it seems like every month or so he says something about how they're really looking into AR, or they're really interested in AR, or like they think it's a really interesting space, or whatever. His like statement that doesn't really say anything, but kind of gives you an idea that they're working on it. I think I could pretty like definitively say that they're working on something like this. The question is that something that could come out this year, or is it going to be something that is 5 years away? I have no idea.
Right. Yeah, and it is nice that Apple has like the discipline to wait on things until it's like really, really good, compared to some other companies that will announce things and then it takes them years to even get it usable.
Yeah, I would say that's generally true. They've had a few duds, but most of the time they're pretty polished on launch.
Yeah, I think they've changed it a little bit. I know like when the Apple Watch came out, it was way better than the competition, but it wasn't very focused. And I think I still have the original one, and I think like for people who it was clearly like a version 1 of a product.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of their other products that they released, like there's not really like a clear version. It's not like, looking back, it's clear that the first iPhone was a version 1. Like it didn't have anywhere near as much as the rest, but like it was still a really, really, really good phone on like day one. And I don't think that the original Apple Watch was like a really, really, really good smartwatch on day one. But I think the newest one is they've learned a lot and improved. So I wouldn't be surprised if they do that again, especially in something that like AR where there's not really competition. And that's kind of like how the iPhone came in, right? Like even though it wasn't perfect and looking back, it had a ton of problems. It just kind of like swept the space and was the best one there because everything else was so terrible. And the Apple Watch kind of did that too. I just think we had higher expectations. And it might be, it could happen. They could do the same thing with a pair of like AR glasses, but there's just like, I don't know, there's a lot of complexity there with glasses. I think, you guys wear glasses, right?
No.
Actually, no.
Oh.
They're not cool enough yet.
Oh. Well, I don't know why I thought you wore glasses, but I bring up that because like glasses have a lot of complexity, right? Like people need glasses to see. And if you're one of those people, then like when you get AR glasses, they hopefully will help you be able to see. Like, so they have to like kind of work with that whole world that's already, getting prescription lenses, getting, I don't know, bifocals and all that stuff. And they probably won't come out with like all of that on day one, but there's a lot of complexity there that I think a lot of people aren't thinking of when it comes to like whether or not AR glasses will work.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, going back to the Apple Watch real quick, like one of the things that I really hope they announce at the coming developer event is, fixing the way the OS works so that, apps like Audible and podcasts and all that can happen natively. Right now there's some, I don't understand the technical complexity, but it's something to do with the format of the audio file itself and the permissions that are allowed for third-party apps to like run in the background. And, and really they've got to do a lot with data and battery concerns there. But Mark's got an Apple Watch and he loves to run with it, except for he can't listen to Audible while he runs. And that's something that I love to do, is like listen to Audible or podcasts while I'm running. And that's the one thing that's keeping me from, getting an Apple Watch right away. Because otherwise it'd be great for running, especially.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can stream iTunes or iTunes Radio. It just streams just fine. But yeah.
I think if you get an audiobook on iTunes, you can listen to it on there, but not Audible.
Yeah, it just seems like a capability that they built for themselves and they haven't quite like made it available to regular developers out there. That's a good one. I would definitely use that as well. So one final question here for each of you. What is one thing that you find unusual in tech right now?
That is an interesting question. Unusual. I don't know. It's kind of hard to, like, when you work in technology all the time and, your whole job in your life is using tech just nonstop. Like, it's hard to know sometimes it's easy to lose perspective on what's usual and unusual, but I'll have to think about that for a second.
I would say, like, this is maybe a kind of an indirect answer, but I'm surprised. Like, I teach a web design class to, like, upper class graphic design students. And, like, I'm very aware of what's happening in tech with, like, new apps launching. I follow Product Hunt and stuff. But these students have no idea that Product Hunt even exists, or most of them, aren't really in tune with like a lot of the developments in tech. So sometimes during my lectures, I'll show like these little things to me that seem like, well, this is, happening. So I'll show some like augmented reality demo as an example of a user interaction or something like that. And they'll just be blown away. Like they can't believe that this existed. And the same thing with like some of my friends and family who don't work in tech. And so to me, it's like unusual in the sense like how little awareness there actually is of what's going on, since we're in the trenches so much. And then what leaks out, via the media, like sensational stories every now and then will leak out about something. And so you'll the general public will become more aware. But in general, I would say like most people just have no idea what's going on with like things like duplex or the fact that self-driving trucks could replace, the largest job provider in the country, very like relatively soon, like some pretty alarming things, but there's just not a general consciousness of those things outside of the tech circles, which makes sense. But to me, I find that consistently surprising when I just talk to people, like how little awareness there is of like some of the ramifications of the tech we're dealing with.
Yeah, I think another thing that I would add to that that's related, and Mark's mentioned this a lot, and I've heard it from other teachers too, is that I think I've always had this default assumption that, the younger kids are the ones that are going to be able to adapt technology quickly. And there's some truth to that. Like they don't, like one thing, like Mark's students and other students that I interact with that are younger, like they don't really even think about the technology. They can use like a bad interface or a good interface. It doesn't really matter to them. They just kind of use it and get it done. They're used to that. But that doesn't mean they're technically sophisticated. So one alarming thing to me has just been seeing that actually it seems like in some ways the kids these days, because we're getting old, are getting less technically sophisticated and not more. So like they're less able to do more complex, like skillful tasks on their devices than they were, just 3 or 4 years ago. So I know Mark's observed that a lot, and I've seen it a few times and then heard it from other teachers. But that's kind of unusual, and I'm not sure what's behind that, but it's a little troubling.
I wonder if that's because they don't have to.
Yeah.
Like before.
Yeah.
When you guys were in high school, when I was in high school, technology was pretty they were our computers weren't so user friendly, right? There was a lot that we needed to learn on our own, and now it's all like just tap tap tap, and it's designed to be easy, and you can do a whole lot without having to like really understand how it all works and learn complex processes.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Like I've been teaching web design now for 10 years, and when we first started, like making a website was not something you could do really without a strong technical aptitude. But over the years, we've got all these tools now, like Squarespace and Wix and all these things that, for a lot of cases, like if they're just building a website for their dad's business, it's actually a whole lot better to use something like Wix or Squarespace than to try to code that from scratch, even though it'd be a great learning exercise. So I've seen that definitely change over time to where, like now, it's like it's really not that technical of a process for most people to make a website for their business or something like that, and that wasn't true even just maybe 5 or so years ago, or not as true.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It'll be interesting to see, like, there's at the same time we've had this big push into like STEM and pushing more and more students into being developers, and I know a ton of developers. So it's interesting. I wonder if it's just like the type of people that we spend our time with, or maybe our expectations have changed. I don't know.
Yeah. The only other thing that I find unusual is that more people aren't using Airtable. I don't know if you've seen Airtable.
I have, yeah.
Fanboy of Airtable now, but like, anyway, if it's amazing. So if you ever need something like a database, or any of your listeners do, like definitely check out Airtable.
Yeah, and you're not getting any like referral revenue for that, Paul? Or...
Pure fanboy.
No, it's true. I set it up. I need to use it more, but I set it up for a couple things like maybe a year ago, and I think it's gotten a lot of new features just this year. I'll have to look back into it. It's pretty cool. So where can people find you guys on the internet?
Well, I write some on Medium, and on every now and then I'll post stuff to Twitter. So those are the main 2 areas probably. And my username is WMDMARK, WMDMark, on both of those.
Cool, and I'll put that in the show notes.
I will, very occasionally post something on Twitter. particularly if I write something. So you can find me at, the handle is at Paul_Johnson. And just one underscore, because if you say 2 underscores, that's a writer in the UK for The Guardian who writes a lot of, political articles. So I get people like calling me some really bad stuff occasionally.
Oh no. That's funny. Yeah, and you guys can find me on Twitter at TimothyBuckSF, and you can find Unco on Twitter at _UncoFM. And I actually just started a new podcast recently with my friend Stephen Aquino. It's called Accessible, and it's a podcast about accessibility in tech. You can find that at accessible.fm. Thank you, guys. It was fun.
Yeah, thank you. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks, Tim.
Yep. See ya.
See ya.
All right. Bye.